Today we're going to look at verifying identities. Hopefully I can give you a few strategies to help you figure this out. I will start off and say that verifying identities is probably not the most intuitive thing that students will do in this course. Hopefully with these strategies though, it'll make it a little easier for you, and with practice you will get better at it. So the first thing I want to let you know is that verifying identities is not the same as solving an equation. Okay, so we are not solving an equation here. What we're trying to do is make one side of our equation look like the other side of the equation. So the most common mistake I see students make is that they try to add the same thing to both sides of the equation or multiply both sides of the equation by something, and that's not what we're doing. In fact, what I would encourage you to do is maybe even just draw a little line down the center and make sure that we're not crossing that line, that whatever we're doing to this identity, we're only doing to one side. All right, so let's start. The thing you might want to try first is to look at the side that's the most complicated and see if you can't just simplify it. And usually through that process, we end up making it look like the other side of the equation. So I notice that this right-handed side is probably the more complicated side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start and try to simplify whatever I can. The first thing I notice is that I'm dealing with secant and cosine. And I know there's a relationship between those. I know that secant is the same as 1 over the cosine. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to use one of those reciprocal identities and rewrite that left-hand side of the equation. Now in doing that, I end up with a cosine in the denominator and a cosine cubed in the numerator. I can actually divide out a cosine x from both of those. And so I end up with 1 minus the cosine squared of x. Now, usually when I see some sort of a expression that has a 1 and some sort of trig function that's squared, that tells me to probably look at our Pythagorean identities. As I look at my Pythagorean identity, I see that 1 minus the cosine squared of x is actually equal to the sine squared of x. And notice that that verifies the identity we were trying to prove. So just real quick to recap what we did on this identity. The first thing we did is we used our reciprocal identity, which is one of our basic identities, and we changed the secant of x to 1 over the cosine of x. After that, we just simplified the fraction, that multiplication in that expression, and we were able to cancel out the cosine of x in the denominator with one of the cosines in the numerator. And then from there, we recognized that 1 minus the cosine squared of x was a Pythagorean identity, and we could change that to sine squared of x, and there we had our identity verified.